Yep. Huh? Is good? Yeah, no, it's good. I just need to mic you up as well.
Two mics.
Of course.
Special.
Under your shirt, that's a microphone. It goes on the outside like this. That's a magnet.
Yeah.
Yep.
Got it.
Perfect. All right. Okay. Now we can. Okay. Now we can start. Do we have a clicker?
No, just this.
We don't. Okay. Well, welcome to OpenAPI Extensibility, the good, the bad, and the YAMLy, which is obviously a pun on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is arguably the best Western movie out there. Who never watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? One, two people. Okay, you are in for a treat. You really should. And for the rest of you, that would be your cue to rewatch this Eternal Classic because it's that good. All right, so yeah, my name is Baruch Sadogurski. I'm a developer productivity advocate and a developer relations advisor with the company called Gradle that you all might know as one or I think the most used now a build tool in the JVM ecosystem. We're going to mention it one more time, I guess. Java champion, ex-CNCF ambassador, and author of a couple of books, dev tools for Java developers, speaking about Java and stuff, and the Liquid software, which is a vision of how we all should release software, including OpenAPI stuff. And this is Laura.
I am the sole technical writer at Gradle, which again is one of the biggest build tools in the world. I'm a huge community builder and advocate for open source, and I fundamentally believe in documentation first. So this is one of the things I'm going to mention over and over again.
Yeah, because the entire thing of standards on top of API is for documentation of those APIs. Yep, so that's kind of a thing. Our invisible partner in crime is Oleg, who actually the author of this talk, and he will deliver the online version in 2 weeks. He couldn't be here, but he's with us in the spirit. You might know him from his work in CloudBees on Jenkins and a bunch of other stuff that he's doing. The most important slide of this talk is this one. Basically, if you go to speaking.jbaruch, you will find a page dedicated for this talk out there. It has all the slides already uploaded, all the links for everything that were mentioned or going to mention, maybe except of the movie, but I guess you'll find with that. The video that I'm recording right now, and because of which we had the delay, on which I apologize again, it's supposed to be in the bottom of every slide, but you know, slides got transformed from Google Slides to PowerPoint without us checking the final version, so slides are hard. Almost as software. Well, speaking.jbaruch, I'm going to mention it again, hopefully you will remember it. Or if you want to, you can actually take a picture of this slide, and that will be the only one that you need. All right, Gradle, I guess. So, yeah, the bottom of our slide. Yeah, Gradle, I guess. Gradle, you might know about the build tool, of course, but as we talk about APIs, REST APIs, there are not much REST APIs in the build tool because it's a command line build tool. You know what does have a lot of REST APIs? A service, and we have one of those. It's called the Velocity, and it's a developer productivity tool and developer environment observability tool that it basically helps you to deliver your software faster regardless of you using or not using Gradle. The build tool. And it has a lot of REST APIs because it's all about developer productivity engineering, which is an engineering way to engineer your developer productivity as opposite to other ways, better coffee machines and better noise cancellation headphones. This is about engineering developer productivity. And for engineering developer productivity, you need a tool that does that, but also plays with everything. And this is where the API is coming. And when we talk about place with everything, well, the modern tech is complicated. CNCF Cloud Native Foundation made a great illustration for how complicated it is by listing all their possible and impossible tools right there, which is great, but it's complicated not only in the cloud native space, it's complicated everywhere. There is a lot of tools that they all need, ideally, to play with each other. And the reason why there is a lot of tools is because we have a how should I say, a paradigm of writing software which urges us to write many tools. The Unix way say that programs should do one thing and do it well, which means we end up with a lot of programs. And the programs should really work well together. And the way they work together is through interfaces which are text-based. So basically, this is a description for everything in software. We have tons of programs, small or large, preferably small, that talk to each other through interfaces, which brings us to, obviously, REST API. And API, the whole idea of those interfaces is exactly the key of how can we allow to write small programs that eventually work together. And the APIs don't have to be text. There are a lot of ways to make sure small programs that do one thing talk to each other. It can be in-memory traffic. It can be streams. It can be a bunch of other stuff that you can see on this side of the screen. There is so many ways for programs to interrupt. And there are also a couple of standards. And the two most popular standards around are OpenAPI and Async API, which brings us to OpenAPI and to the bad, the good, and the YAMLy parts of OpenAPI in general and OpenAPI extendability in particular. And we have on stage at least the good and the bad, and Laura being the good, take it away with the good parts.
Yeah, I'll start with the good. And OpenAPI is good. Ever since 2021, when they came out with OpenAPI Spec 3.1, it became really popular. Why? Because it was really powerful for documenting your APIs, right? You have a JSON or YAML file, and you describe how your interfaces work, and that's it. And from that interface, you can produce beautiful documentation, or you can produce code, right? So here's a little overview. But the main thing is that since 2021, the ecosystem has blown up. Everyone is using OpenAPI. And if you're not, hopefully you're thinking about it. And most products, especially in this room, like your API is your product. And if it's not well documented, people aren't going to use it. And this concept of documentation first, it works really well with OpenAPI because you write the spec first, and then you use the tools that are out there in this huge ecosystem to get the code, right? And a lot of code you can get for free. All right, so we are from Gradle, and that's a small part of the ecosystem. That's all JVM based, right? In the Java world alone, we have over 100 plugins with OpenAPI functionality. That says a lot, okay? So, hey, who's using OpenAPI? Oh, there you go. Everyone, right? And if you're not, again, you should be using it. And this is an overlook of all of our partners and customers. Again, they're either already using it or they're thinking about using it in the future.
And the reason why we ask them, because this is where interoperability is, we need to know if they are using OpenAPI to make our lives of integrating with them easier. This is why we care.
And so back to Develocity, which is the tool that Baruch mentioned earlier. It is our Build Insights tool. That also comes with a RESTful API interface, and we take really good care of documenting that API using OpenAPI. And we actually have a manual that we release with the tool to make sure that our users fully understand how to use that API. So if they want to see, hey, how did build number 5003 fail? Well, there's a RESTful endpoint they can call with a build IDE, and they get all that information, and then they can parse it how they want. But that information is really simple and really easy to get. And so, versioning, good documentation, that's part of our brand too, right? And it's thanks to OpenAPI. So one of the really popular tools in our ecosystem is the OpenAPI generator. And that one, from your YAML file or your JSON file, produces Java code for your client or server-side application or service. And that one is also a Develocity partner. And if you want to check out, if you're curious, and I really strongly encourage you to do this, you can check out their public Develocity instance at this link on this slide, and you can see whether or not their latest source code, their latest build is actually building correctly. Is it compiling? Is it not? It's super interesting to look at. And if you want to nerd out a little bit, you can even see if their tests are passing and help them fix them, because open source needs a little help too.
And we do it not only for OpenAPI, we actually do it for tons of popular open source projects, Spring Framework, a lot of projects from Apache Foundation, Micronaut, JUnit, Redpack, you name it. You can go to Hibernate, you can go to any of those and just see how their developer productivity is doing. Is their builder passing? How are their tests? Why their builds are slow? And all this kind of stuff. Will give you the idea what Develocity generally does, but it's also very, very interesting insight into how the popular open source projects that you use every day are actually being developed and get some ideas out of there.
Yep, and again, if they have APIs, these guys are partners, and they're using OpenAPI as well. So again, the ecosystem is huge, it's really interesting, and OpenAPI is only as good as it is flexible, right? Because when you're dealing with supporting all of these different APIs for all these different companies, you need to be extensible, you need to be flexible. And that's why we need to talk about not just all of the OpenAPI capabilities today that we have, but extensions. So I don't know if you guys have used OpenAPI, but if you have an interface and it's slightly out of the ordinary, it's slightly out of spec, you have to use extensions. And extensions, they support tons of objects, you can see, but really you'll just have an entry in your JSON or your YAML file, and it'll be prefixed with an X. So here's an example. So in this case, we have some entry that describes some metadata about a blog post. And in order to describe that blog post, we wanted to add an image, a URL, some tags, and that doesn't exist in the spec. So we had to create this extension called XAPIs.json. Horribly named, right? Does anyone know from just reading this that it's metadata about a blog? No. What if you're working for an OpenAPI generator and you have to go from this, I have to extract some information and generate Java code? How on earth are you going to do that?
The Java code will be called APIs.json, the class. It doesn't make much sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And we do it too, right? In Develocity, we use extensions, OpenAPI extensions. For example, we want consumers to be able to project a logo of Develocity if they want to. And we have to use X logo and provide the URL for that logo in case they want it. Okay, that's fine. There's another example we use. We have tags, and tags only allow names and descriptions in the spec. And we wanted a display name. So, hey, again, we kind of came up with a pretty obvious extension for it. But, at the end of the day, this seems stupid for a spec from 2021. Because something like a logo should be standardized, right? It shouldn't be an extension. Maybe it should be part of the spec. So now we're going to go to the ugly.
Yeah, that brings us to a less nicer parts of the spec and especially the extension spec. And as Laura mentioned, you can write the spec, you can describe your API objects either in JSON or in YAML. Now, they both sound like a good choice for describing an API, right? YAML is yet another markup language, and markup sounds very reasonable. And JSON is JavaScript notation, object notation, and notation also sounds like something that should be very good in describing things. And generally, the problem is that, as Laura mentioned, extensions can be anything. And when we are talking about anything, suddenly having a markup or a notation language is not such a great idea. So you can see here an example of an AWS extension. And this is the authorizer is actually an object. It's a thing. It's not an endpoint. It's something that does something. And describing something that does something in either object notation or markup language is actually a terrible idea. And this is how we get all the non-fun part of programming in YAML, including absolutely insane nesting with all those rules about the intention and all the syntax that look exactly the same but not really the same, and it's really, really bad for that. It's getting even worse, and we're going to talk about it in a second. Also, the extensions, generally the YAML and JSON, are not designed to implement the don't repeat yourself principle, because they are, again, markup and object notation. So when you try to reuse parts of the spec, this breaks as well because they are not designed for it, right? So basically, YAML and JSON are not great for describing extensions, which can really be anything. And the bad parts are kind of related to that, but go beyond just the rant of, hey, this is not the greatest language to describe stuff, right? So there is a great, here you go. Extensions has tension right in the name for a very good reason. First of all, frankly and unfortunately, extensions in OpenAPI are legacy. Are legacy for Swagger, which is where OpenAPI kind of grew up with. And while everything else being very well curated and kind of brought into the future with working on it, extensions really left behind. Right, so again, here you can see the state of specification of extensions, and you can see the last commit in 2017, like 7 years ago. No one touches this thing because no one really wants to touch this thing. And no one wants to touch this thing because people took it to so insane places that trying to bring it up now under a specification is really, really painful, right? So first of all, it's a Wild West. Speaking about Westerns, that's a nice pun. It's a Wild West. Everybody does with this whatever they like really crazy stuff. First of all, almost the entire spec can be expressed in X. Instead of using standard objects, you can just go and rewrite everything as extension, and it will work. It completely defeats the purpose of the spec, and there are tons of companies and projects that do exactly that. Stuff like data blobs, stuff like encrypted text, because no one said it cannot be done. How about flow control, ifs, and loops? described in YAML. I mean, And of course, because everybody took it to such an insane directions, no one thinks about reusing this stuff because it's so unique now and so bizarre that reusing it doesn't make any sense. So yeah, it is not great. Right? Now, the problem with it, that it's also on top of that, everybody re-implement the same thing. How many you think projects or products implement the X dash logo?
Or the XAuth.
Or the XAuth.
Hundreds of thousands. Look on GitHub.
Right. And everybody redo it because, well, it's not standard. Amazon does weird thing with it. We're just going to write our own instead of using theirs. So it's really this Babylon, like the Tower of Babylon of extensions. And in the end of the day, whether some companies do it on purpose and create stuff that you will have a hard time migrating from, or they're just doing it because there is no other standard way, extensions, instead of promoting interchangeability as the spec envisioned, they are actually a tool for a lock-in, because more specs are generated by tool and they leverage extensions, and then you kind of locked in with it. And as I mentioned, YAML is a really terrible idea for describing weird stuff, and JSON is not much better. And obviously, OpenAPI doesn't address it in any way, right? So, yeah. Now, as I mentioned, it's all over the place. Authorization models, parameter values for samples, feature flags, conditions, stateful behavior, you name it, everything around it. But there is hope.
There is hope. So we've been kind of saying some negative things about YAML, but it's not going away.
We said a lot.
Yeah, it's not going away. So if you're thinking about writing an API, use OpenAPI and start with the YAML. It's fine. Okay, we'll just talk about extensions later. But try it out. Try documentation first approaches to your API design. And put out a YAML file, test it with folks, create documentation with it before you write a single line of code. Now, if you're gonna write extensions, maybe word of warning with everything we said, and if you have written extensions, share it with the community or push the folks at Project Moonwalk to put in the spec. So what's Project Moonwalk? It's OpenAPI 4. It's supposed to come out at the end of this year. And again, these folks need help. Okay, there's a SIG, but if you've written a spec and you have extensions, or you're thinking about writing a spec, participate, okay? Get on there. They have weekly meetings. Try it out. The spec is almost complete, but it could use a little love, okay? So try it out. It's OpenAPI 4. It's going to fix most things, but not everything without your help, okay? And it's going to expand the spec. It's not just going to be RESTful APIs, it'll be RPCs too, okay? But it's supposed to improve the user experience. Oh man, half our slide is gone. Introduce new features. And there are cool things, right, that are kind of coming out, like workflows, right, that are not only just describing something like a post endpoint, they're actually supposed to describe how you're going to use that endpoint. So tons of great things. Please try it out. It's great. It's coming. And the one thing we want your help with is making extensions part of the spec, okay?
But wait, there is an extension registry for OpenAPI 4. It contains one extension, X Twitter. There's so many questions. I mean, a lot. But this is where it is now. Definitely we need some work.
So yes, please participate, try it out, use it, make it part of your development flow, okay? Get involved. That's all. If you're gonna take one thing away from today, it's try it out, okay? And then use a documentation first approach. And again, if you develop OpenAPI spec, you know, use extensions carefully, okay? And remember, whatever you're using, it's probably been done by 200 other companies. Maybe it should be part of the spec. Maybe you can send an email to the Moonwalk folks.
Maybe you need to put a Twitter handle somewhere in the REST API. Use the X-Twitter extension from OpenAPI 4.
And then make sure to version and keep your API up to date, especially if you're going with a documentation first approach. This is how your users are going to use and see your APIs. It's through documentation. They're not going to read your source code, so make sure it is up to date and it is versioned. Thank you.
Now, since you didn't have this URL at the bottom of every slide, I just want to bring it up once again. This is where you find the slides, all the links, the video that I hopefully recorded, and this is where you learn more. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we are right here wrapping up, so talk to us, especially to Laura. She knows OpenAPI inside out. Thank you very much.
Huge YAML files. Huge YAML files.
Huge YAML files. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you.
All right, let me turn it off. Yes.